Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is a belated Ukraine war news update for the 22nd of April 2023. Sorry that I am late to do this. I had family things to attend to, like getting lost in the depths of Hampshire, trying to get one of my twin boys to a football match. I think the FSB have hacked Google Maps to the point where I was driving around endlessly, because that's the main intention for the FSB at the moment, is to stop random YouTubers get their children to football matches on a Saturday morning. That's definitely what they're keen on achieving. So well done them. Anyway, I'm here. Here's the news. It's late. Hey ho. Usual starting point, which is the Ukrainian figures for the Russian losses for the day before, all the usual caveats, etc., etc. I find these indicatively useful. 680 liquidated personnel, pretty much where it's been for the last few days. Tanks 4, APCs 4, 5 artillery systems, 4 anti-aircraft warfare systems. I wonder whether they're including the 2 that have been rolled recently. The S-400 I reported yesterday that had fallen off the road. I would be... It's a shame if they do include them, because they'll be up and back on their feet within no time, I'm sure. I'm going to show you another one today. 4 drones, 5 vehicles and fuel tanks, 3 pieces of special equipment. I've talked about there being an explicit attempt by the Ukrainians to hit artillery systems, I think to hit anti-aircraft warfare systems as well, but also to hit special equipment such as radar installations and electronic warfare systems that jam all sorts of things, but predominantly drone usage. So I guess that's a fairly average day, but 4 anti-aircraft warfare systems is a good day for the Ukrainians. As you can see, 289 over the whole course of the war. We're 420 odd days into the war, so that's less than 1 a day on average. So to have 4 in a day is a good day for that, and that will be hugely important in terms of coming counter-offensive. They will need some kind of at least localized air superiority. So where they are particularly planning on doing air counter-offensives, they want to be able to use combined arms initiatives. So they will need to use helicopters to support. They will need to use fixed-wing aircraft to support in hitting enemy installations, etc., etc. So you might see an uptick in the targeting of anti-aircraft warfare systems in particular areas. Okay, how do we support some of this data? Well, in terms of drones, 4 out of 5 Shahed drones were shot down over the Ukraine. Due to the new Iranian delivery, says no reports, Russian drone attacks have increased over the last week. There have been drone attacks every single night, I think, for 4 nights now. I thought that they would wait and release them all in one, because I think that would be far more sensible. But I don't know, who am I to second guess the Russians and their tactics? They have been releasing sort of 10 a night, 12, 9. Here we've got 5. I don't know whether that's worth doing. Yes, you are fixing the Ukrainian air defenses, but you'd also think that overcoming them by sending them all at once would be a better idea, but maybe they don't have the ability to do that. I don't know. Russians, there have been reports of large numbers of Russian captives being taken recently, particularly in the Bakhmut area. Bakhmut is pretty dicey. It looks like the Russians have interdicted the highway to the north, the 00506 highway going through Kromova. So I'll look into that for my map update. But there have been, alongside of that, reports that they've taken heavy losses, as well as that in terms of deaths and casualties, but also captives. Here is some more footage. This is a Tor M2 air defense system that has taken a quick corner somewhere in Melitopol. Looks like the truck took a quick corner and it fell off the back of a truck. That won't be damage that sees it out of action permanently, but that driver's probably going to be staying well away from Windows over the next week or so. This is what happened with an S-400 yesterday, over the last couple of days. So I wonder whether those numbers for air defense systems include these. It could well do. Okay, another bomb dropped from a Russian bomber was found in Belgorod. Possibly it's an FAB 500. This bomb, unlike the previous one, did not explode. So the previous one detonated as it was supposed to, and there was a little puff of sort of dust as the bomb actually dropped, and then I think it was something like 18 seconds before it then exploded, and that was because it's got a delayed fuse, which we've been talking about recently in terms of our artillery ammunition. So Sladkov says that Russia will soon be dropping 3 to 5 kilometer glide bombs. That will be a problem. He says 5 to 7 Russian aircraft drop UMPK bombs every day now, but 30 to 40 will take part in bombing raids in the future. He says the range is 40 kilometers. I think this is something that Ukrainians are going to be should be worried about. The fighter bomber says that this was probably a UMPK Fab 562 glide bomb, but the wings didn't initiate for some reason, so the bomb just fell. He says the fuse was set on delay and detonated as it should for targeting an underground target, and that was the one that fell in the middle of Belgrade. So but quite why it fell off the plane over Belgrade, I don't know. Yeah, a bomb that size presents real difficulties in control. It apparently requires 8 vanes on the tail for control. Think of the wing surface this will require just to aim it, much less make it glide. The bigger and heavier the bomb, the less it's going to glide, and the more it's going to want to adhere to gravity and fall straight down. So, there will be issues with making larger bombs in this way, but it's still going to be something that the Ukrainians will have to consider going forward. These are already a problem at the moment along the front line. Right, odds and sods. Ukraine does not rule out a massive missile attack by the Russian Federation on May the 9th. Why May the 9th? It's Victory Day on May the 9th, where they celebrate what happened at the end of the war, Soviet victory over Nazi Germany in 1945. I say the war. We're in the war, I guess, for many. I think that's a hugely important date that the Russians, or that Putin, because he likes the symbolism of dates, will try and eke out a victory and seek a victory in Bakhmut particularly. The head of the press service of the Southern Defense Forces, Natalia Humenyuk, has said, quote, "It is unlikely that the enemy will have enough strength, means and time to prepare several such strikes, but they will surely gather something for one." Almost certainly. And strong statement from Boris Pistorius. So Boris Pistorius has taken over as German defense minister, has really stepped up to the plate, and he's gaining a lot of plaudits for doing so. Indeed, Noel Reports is one of those. He has been a game changer for not only Germany, but also the Western world in terms of aid supplies. He truly accelerated. So the German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius believes limited attacks by Ukraine on Russian territory are an acceptable tactic in repelling the Russian invasion. In such a war, it is, quote, completely normal for the attacked party to advance into enemy territory, for example, to cut off supply routes, he said on the political talk show May Brit Illner on Thursday evening. Quote, as long as no cities, civilians or civilian areas are attacked, one will necessarily have to accept that. So he's now advocating for and justifying perhaps previous attacks within Russian territory, or certainly future attacks, if they are necessary for the defenders, in this case Ukraine, to achieve certain important objectives. That you're going to expect that in war, and I think that's a good thing to be able to put this stuff into the information space so that it becomes. I have talked about this before, something called the mere exposure effect. The more you talk about something, the more credible it becomes, the more acceptable it becomes. And I think if people start talking about this, and when it does happen, it's a bit like the airframes fixed wing aircraft. The more we talk about it, the more acceptable it becomes. And when they do get given F-16s, then Russia won't, sound off as much, because actually everyone's been saying it's going to happen for that long anyway. But I digress. So we've just had Ramstein 11, which is where the contact group of allies get together and say, right, how can we help Ukraine? What has happened? Well, it doesn't seem like an awful lot, because essentially most of what they need has been provided for the coming counteroffensive, and it's kind of waiting for the counteroffensive to take place to see what they will need beyond that. Now, there are some people still, or many people still, talking about how actually they will have plenty enough stuff for the counteroffensive. Some claiming, putting numbers on tanks and APCs and IFVs and other vehicles, over 1,000. Some people saying, and that's going to present a serious problem for the Russians if they are all utilized effectively. Okay. The priority for Ukraine now is ground-based air defense systems to provide protection against Russian missile attacks. Ukraine received a green light. This is kind of summary. Ukraine received a green light for cooperation with the NATO Procurement Agency, NSPA. The West handed Ukraine more than 230 tanks and 1,500 other armored vehicles to equip 9 armored brigades. So that's already happened. That's come out of the Ramstein. About 25,000 Ukrainian soldiers are currently undergoing training in Germany, and about 8,000 have already completed it and returned home. So that is quite a lot of people. A few other things to say. So no report says the outcomes of Ramstein are Germany and Netherlands are providing Ukraine with more mine rollers, vehicles, and fuel tanks. Allies will conduct training for tankers as well as for air defense operators. Abrams tanks will arrive in Germany in a few weeks. The West handed Ukraine already more than 230 tanks and 1,500 other AFVs to equip 9 brigades. A Leopard 2 service centre will be created in Poland. Ukraine received a green light for cooperation with the NATO Procurement Agency, and allies are all ready to support Ukraine as long as necessary. So a few other things that came out. Latvia have announced that they will transfer all of their remaining Stinger man-pads. Those are man portable air defense systems. So these shoulder-mounted missile systems that a bit like ATGMs for tanks, but for aircraft. And Stingers are one of the most famous ones that the Americans have used for some time. The Latvians are going to give the rest of those. Spain will deliver 6 of the 10 promised Leopard 2A4 tanks to Ukraine in the coming days, the head of the Spanish Ministry of Foreign Affairs has said. According to the minister, Spain wants to supply Ukraine with 6 Leopard 2A4 tanks out of only 10 promised in the coming days. After that, there will be a second package with 4 more tanks. The Defense Minister for Canada, Anita Anand, announced a new military aid package worth $39 million for Ukraine. The assistance includes $34.6 million contribution to NATO's CAP Trust Fund to supply NATO with 3.3 million litres of fuel supplies. And Michael Weiss quotes from the New York Times article saying, and officials had said it could take years for them to actually reach Ukrainian battlefields. So talking about Abrams tanks here, and the Americans giving them these tanks, and it was all the battle over free the Leopards, and the UK got in with the Challengers, and then US said, okay, we're going to produce Abrams, and then everyone else didn't have an excuse not to, so Leopards came out. But then there was talk about, it's not going to be till 2024, it's not going to be till the end, it's not going to be, and then slowly it's been sort of moving forward, it appears. And this article quotes, as it turned out, American officials were able to move Abrams tanks to Ukraine faster than expected. Defense officials said they moved quickly to expedite the delivery and now say that they believe the tanks can be used in combat in a few months. So they'll get them to Germany or Poland, they'll get trained on them, and then they'll be used. So that looks like an imminent transport of those. And that's huge, really, because if you can give a bunch of Abrams tanks in that time frame, then you can give a bunch more in a similar time frame, arguably. And the US have a whole load of Abrams. I find it, and I've talked about this before, but when you have things like Spain, who probably have virtually no tanks that are able to be made. There was that talk from I think did it come from Defense Secretary Ben Wallace for the UK, kind of hinted that there is a Mediterranean country, and it could be Spain, could be Italy, that said, or it could be Greece, said that, hey, we don't have any working tanks. It turns out we looked in our inventory and we don't have any working tanks to give to Ukraine, and which is a sad state of affairs. Now, the US, I've talked about the sheer volume of AFVs in the US. I mean, we're talking thousands, rather than individual European countries will have at most, like, unless it's one of the major countries, but you're talking up to 100, some countries up to 200 tanks, and then infantry fighting vehicles maybe under 100, hundreds, whatever. And and America has like 6,000. Yeah, it's just a massive difference. So I know lots of people, so Americans go, well, why is it America that has to come up with all the goods here? Well, actually, because they are the only people that can come up with the goods in the significant enough numbers. Yes, if all of Europe get together and give a few of these and a few of them, then it's significant. And that's what's happened with leopards, and that needs to continue. But America just has so many vehicles that they could help Ukraine with. It's just phenomenal. Anyway, I digress. So let's move on. Portugal will send 5 armored. This is kind of what I'm talking about. Portugal will send 5 armored vehicles for rescue and medical support to Ukraine. 3 M113s. I mean, these are old, right? America has like gazillions of these, and have given a bunch. 2 M577 as well. So Portugal Defence Minister Carreiras has said, now that's great, good stuff, but 5 APCs is, I mean, Joe Bloggs in Northamptonshire Farm's got more APCs sitting on his farm that he can sell to Ukraine. Do you know what I mean? So it's about, this is great, and I'm not decrying anyone giving stuff to Ukraine, but it's about the numbers, about what they're going to need, especially given the attrition that a counteroffensive will lead to. Right, Azil 131 mounted AZP S60 57mm autocannon in Ukrainian service. So we see a lot of these are technicals, except instead of on the back of an SUV, it's on the back of some kind of like farm lorry or something, some kind of old school truck, but does a job. And we've seen these technicals used by both sides. I never see them actually in. I see lots of footage like this, and they're clearly practicing here. I doubt they're actually shooting it actually at any Russian targets. They could be, but you never know actually how much damage these things do in war. I don't know, maybe in this conflict, but I assume they do. Good stuff. Looks interesting. Right. Okay, last thing before we get on to a couple of geopolitical points, and this is still to do with sort of military aid, in this case, Russia. This is a very decent piece in Forbes, what's perfectly round, made of metal, and keeping Russia from replacing the 2,000 tanks it's lost in Ukraine. Answer is ball bearings. Now, I did a big old thread on this months and months ago. In fact, 90% of you viewers won't have watched that because it was in my earlier ones, where I talked about how important ball bearings are for the Russian railway service. In fact, it talks about that in this article, and they were struggling. They're a railway country, they're a huge country, and they're a railway army, but they are unable to, because of the sanctions, unable to replace carriage, rolling stock, the kind of trucks and the wheels, because they require ball bearings and they just can't get hold of them. Anyway, the article starts, a shortage in modern optics is throttling Russia's ability to manufacture new T-72s, T-90s, T-80s, blah, blah, blah. But optics aren't the only thing in short supply in the Russian armoured vehicle industry. The Russians are desperately short of ball bearings, which they used to get from the US and Europe before the US and Europe tightened their sanctions on Russian industry. Indeed, I think Sweden has one of the main ball bearing manufacturers. I did show you a chart months ago of the ball bearing, the main ball bearing exporters in the world. A new study from the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington confirmed that independent analysts have been saying for months tanks and other modern armored vehicles need a lot of ball bearings, and Russia doesn't have enough to maintain steady production of new vehicles. Quote, in 2020, this is Sam Bendit, who I quote from quite a lot. Actually, he was one of the people who contributed to the paper. Historically, Russia has imported most of its high-quality ball bearings from Western manufacturers. In 2020, for instance, Russia imported over $419 million worth of ball bearings. That's just ball bearings, $419 million worth. Around 55% of which originated in Europe and North America. Germany was Russia's largest trading partner, taking up 17% of its total imports that year. And it goes on to say, how much of an issue that is with building new tanks and even restoring old tanks. Yes, there were small stockpiles of ball bearings in Russia when the wider war kicked off, but Russian rail operators needed those bearings too. If anything, the railway's hunger for bearings grew as their 13,000 locomotives moved more and more replacement men and equipment to the Ukrainian front. Given a choice between building fewer tanks or freezing transport across Russia, Moscow did the smart thing and chose the former. So they've decided to build fewer tanks to keep their trains moving. But that has meant that their stockpile of ball bearings is problematically low. Careful analysis of the activity at Uralvagonzavod and Omsktransmash strongly hints that these are defense manufacturers, strongly hints that the factories every month are shipping just a few dozen modern-ish tanks, either new build T-72 BM3s or T-90Ms or reconditioned T-72s, T-80s and T-90s that technicians have pulled out of long-term storage, which is why the Russians are traveling back in time, technologically speaking, and reactivating 1960s vintage T-62s and 1950s vintage T-55s that have been mouldering in storage since the 80s. The older tanks require fewer modern components and fewer ball bearings. They're hopelessly outmatched in a stand-up fight with better equipped Ukrainian forces, but they at least slow down the Ukrainians. Quote, the T-55 in this sense is a resource saver and an opportunity to buy time, a Kremlin source said. So maybe Russia eventually ramps up tank production by swapping good bearings for bad bearings, having also traded modern digital optics for inferior analog dot optics. These tanks no longer are state-of-the-art. Sure, they might look like T-72 BM3s or T-90Ms, but on the inside, where it really counts, they're less capable and less durable. Ball bearings are a problem for Russia. Okay, going on to geopolitical topics. US hits Russia's Shadow Fleet. I've talked about this before. Largest oil carrier to India is now deprived of international insurance. The Shadow Fleet of dozens of tankers, which transports Russian oil to Asia bypassing Western sanctions, was hit by the US sanctions India registered Gatik Ship Management, which became a major carrier of oil from Russia last year, has lost international insurance because of a violation of the price cap mechanism. This is where the price cap hopefully is working, which is if you don't buy within that price or adhering to the price cap that has been set, then you will not get insurance. And because almost all insurance is centered in, well, mainly London, actually, Lloyd's are traditionally the big maritime insurer by memory, then they've been able to create this price cap and do these sanctions and be able to have that universally effective globally, because actually there just aren't the other people who provide insurance. So by having this kind of almost monopoly on maritime insurance, it's worked in favor of Western sanctions. So the Mumbai headquartered company, which nobody knew about until last year, assembled a fleet of 48 tankers with a combined capacity of more than 30 million barrels and worth $1.4 billion. Almost all of the vessels entered Russian ports and exported oil or oil products, a Vortexa analysis showed. It'd be really interesting to see whether that stops them from moving oil, whether they will, I don't know the ins and outs of moving vast fleets of oil without insurance. Now, I know that some ports, or many ports, in fact, indeed pretty much all ports around the world, should not allow ships to dock without proper insurance. But whether those rules will be kind of bent in certain places that are really willing to get cheap oil from Russia. Where there's a will, there's a way. Unfortunately, in this case, good to see Ukraine supporters protesting outside the Brazilian embassy in Lisbon against Lula's visit to Portugal. So Lula's been controversial recently in straddling both sides of the fence when it comes to the war, trying to appease Russia. Sergei Lavrov was the foreign minister, was visiting Brazil recently, and so they were kind of all talk was kind of siding to some degree with Russia. And then after he left, they were like, oh no, pro-US stance, more, or at least not quite as pro-Russian as it was, trying to appease both sides here. But the Ukrainians in Portugal are they are certainly being vocal about their displeasure of Lula visiting Portugal. The Brazilian president recently spouted more pure propaganda from Russia, said Tim White. And then the last piece that I'll be touching on is in terms of sanctions, in the context of sanctions again. Now, this is the US Ukrainian allies considering a near total ban on exports to Russia. So, effectively, what they've decided is rather than adding things to, it's a bit like organ donation, right? In the UK, we've recently changed the system so that everyone's automatically an organ donor unless you opt out of it, right? So if you die in a car crash, your organs can be given, um, because you've de facto given permission. Now, in this situation, all things are sanctioned unless they are excluded from that list, rather than everything not being sanctioned until you put it on the sanction list. And so this will potentially have a much wider ranging effect on the Russian economy. But there are potentially serious obstacles to its implementation. To come into force in the EU, the new criteria would need to be adopted by all members, and that would set off a testy debate given the likely backlash from companies that still export goods to Russia, alongside the risk of retaliation by Moscow. In a near total embargo on exports, if a near total embargo on exports is imposed, much of the remaining trade flows from these countries with Russia would evaporate. A spokesperson for the US National Security Council declined to comment on the prospect of such a move. So far, sanctions have almost halved the value of EU and G7 exports to Russia, with limits on everything from electronics to luxury items. That still leaves $66 billion worth of goods from Europe, the US, and Canada and Japan going in, according to the Geneva-based trade data monitor. Moscow has stopped publishing figures on imports, understandably, but several international monitors and governments track their exports and Russia and customs data. But even with existing curbs, Russia has managed to import some sanctioned US and European components via third countries. That is putting an increased focus on the G7 and EU on tackling sanctions circumvention. I've talked about that recently, especially enhancing the monitoring of so-called dual-use goods that can serve either a military or a civilian purpose. Anyway, watch this space. I think that if they can manage to get that through, that would be super important. Russia really needs to hurt at home for the population and for politicians to start thinking the war is really, truly a bad idea. Anyway, thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. Check out my frontline update that I will bring out imminently. Sorry for the delay. You're all legends. Thank you, and toodle pips. Well, actually, not all of you. Some of you are Russian bots, so you're not legends. You need to have a look in the mirror. Anyway, see you later. Bye.